This sort of conversation you and I are having is actually a little bit socially risky to have. It's threatening to the people who are in charge and have power because they can't say these things. In the future, we're going to probably have to use less energy, not because an authoritarian regime is telling us. It's just there's going to be less energy on the planet. I mean, we've sucked it out with a larger straw. It's going to tip that apple cart a little bit and people ain't going to be happy. So I'm not rooting for that scenario, and yet I see it speeding towards us. Once energy flattens out or starts to decline, we're going to experience the reverse. This will not be a normal event, but it will be a great simplification. It will be one of the biggest events in the history of our species in coming decades. The one thing that unites all the problems that we've mentioned so far is governance. I don't think our governance system can even manage the current situation, let alone the whack-a-mole of all this stuff coming down. My blood pressure just went up again because I'm saying things that shouldn't maybe be so glibly said on a public video. And yet, here's where we are, Nate. Our entire economic system has been predicated on more and more oil that is roughly the same affordability every year. That is about to change right now.
And I know you got gripes with Mr. Guy McPherson, but he does have a great metaphor that says the only way the plane stays aloft is if it keeps moving forward. And it's kind of similar to this idea that constant expansion is required in order to prevent the whole thing from collapsing. And then, as you're saying, it's almost feeding into this. In order to service the debt, we have to keep expanding, which is going to require more energy.
But since you brought it up, here's my gripe with Guy McPherson. I've never met the guy, but he is absolutely certain that humans are going to go extinct and there's going to be this runaway climate event. And if he had said that in the next 100 years this might be possible, I wouldn't quibble with his science because I am very worried about climate change. It's his certainty that I quibble with. And his absolute predictions that have not come to pass on human proteins denaturing in the next decade, which is already past, and things like that. But as far as his concern about the thermal inertia of humans burning carbon millions of times faster, and actually thousands of times faster than the mass extinctions of the past that were started by volcanic provinces and lava basalts, he's not wrong about that. I just, on all these things, it's not just Guy McPherson. There is a certain sort of personality out there that is very charismatic and authoritative and says things definitively. And I'm sure my podcast could be much more popular if I was certain about what would happen, because humans like certainty. They don't like uncertainty. I'm a scientist. I look at the world as a probability distribution. And the middle of my distribution says that one of the next 3 recessions is going to be a depression. There's also possibilities. You mentioned AI before. There's military geopolitical possibilities on the dark side of the distribution. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm very confident that oil depletion is going to play a huge role in coming decades, and that the end of growth for human society is nigh. Does that have to be Armageddon? No. In the United States, we use 100 times more energy in the footprint of our lights and our cameras and our cars and our airplanes and our shopping centers than our bodies need to eat and survive. So we eat 2,000 some calories, and we eat 200,000 calories as the average American on an energy footprint. I think Canadians are even more. So if that drops 20%, we're still one of the richest generations in the history of our species. We use double the energy as most places in Europe. In Spain, only uses 50 times more energy than their bodies need. Spain has a great living standard. They have a better hospital system than the United States does. I think climate is going to be a problem for Spain. But it's the issue of how do we adapt to lower energy and material throughput while the ecological environmental situation is getting worse. That's kind of at the core of the story that I'm telling.
Yeah, I mean, my only pushback to that would be that we know that what you're saying is true, that there are certainties here that the depletion is is happening, that it will ultimately reach a point where the contraction has very noticeable social impacts, which they might not be resulting in an immediate descent into like an Armageddon situation, but nonetheless, there's going to be a rapid deterioration of what we perceive to be standard of living. It might improve our standard of living because we might come to realize, well, maybe we don't need all this shit to be happy.
It might improve our non-material standard of living, is what you mean.
Sure, but there's still going to be this period of time where people have to adjust. And I mean, if history is any indication, I think human beings have the ability to potentially come together at the last minute and make the appropriate changes so we don't go extinct, or at least maintain some measure of the standard of living we have now. But, it seems as though it's not logic that's steering the ship right now. So ultimately, like, we have to hit a wall here. And I guess maybe that's where some of the alarmists might say that if you don't, and there's different arguments to float about, what is the most effective way to change public opinion. One of those ways is to, give people the worst case scenario with the hopes that they actually are scared into action. Some people might say that scares them into inaction. What are your thoughts on that?
You're asking really good questions, Nate, but each one requires like 10 or 15-minute answers, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. I disagree with you that most people think that contraction is coming for a couple reasons. First of all, on the oil front, there are many people that think we will develop tertiary recovery and will drill the Arctic and other places, and that technology will overtake depletion. I disagree with that. I think depletion is running faster than technology. But more broadly than that, our culture remains energy blind. And you're right, Ukraine and Russia and what's happening in Europe has woken up some people to what's going on. You just said Canada's wanting to triple its nuclear energy, so they're starting to figure out what's going on. But most people still think that technology, humans will figure something out. We always have in the past. AI is going to develop, blah, blah, blah. But keep in mind that all of the people that envision some shiny George Jetson technological future or whatever their plans are basing that presumption on a lived experience that, with the exception of 2020, with the exception of the great financial crisis, with the exception of some energy crisis in the 1970s, the two world wars, and the Great Depression, with those exceptions, humans have had more energy in our global society every single year the last 150 years. And so this is like this, we feel that that's a natural law, that that's going to continue to increase, and it's not. I struggle with messaging. I've been researching this, and it's not just energy. It's human behavior, it's the environment, it's anthropology, it's neuroscience, it's debt, it's energy properties, it's biodiversity. There's a system of how things fit together, and I do struggle with how to communicate it, because a lot of people in our society have trauma. I could argue 80 to 90% of people have had trauma in their childhood or their lives, and they don't need another thing to be fearful about. And for those people, they really shouldn't listen to yours or my podcast. But for some people, they got the bat signal of Canadian Prepper and the Great Simplification. They want to better understand what's going on, to make better decisions for their own families and their lives. And I think we have to understand what's possible and not say this one thing is going to happen. I mean, for my work, I think there's two paths. One is the Mordor economy, where we print money, we develop some new tweaks along the edges that AI helps us extract oil or copper or other things a little bit more. Granted, that's not going to save any of the environmental problems. It's going to make them worse. And the productivity that frees up on capital and labor will offset the decline in energy surplus for a little bit. But what will happen is we'll have a larger gross economy, but more and more of it will be into the energy and mining sector, and we'll need to spend more and more money mitigating and repairing environmental damages. I refer to that as a Mordor economy. The other scenario is the name of my podcast, which is that humans over time solve problems, and we're master problem solvers. And usually when we solve a problem, we add complexity or nodes to a system, and complexity requires more energy. What we've just lived through this last century is an anomaly in human history as far as the economic growth. And you could call it a great complexification. The average American household has 63 devices plugged in. Think about that. All the complex machinery and spark plugs and little neodymium nodes and things like that. Our system is unbelievably complex. But once energy flattens out or starts to decline, we're going to experience the reverse, which is a simplification. And I would argue that since we have printed $350 to $400 trillion worth of financial claims on a static to declining biophysical pool of actual oil and coal and lumber and forests and dolphins, that this will not be a normal event, but it will be a great simplification. It will be one of the biggest, most momentous events in the history of our species in coming decades.
Yeah, and I think you're being euphemistic when you say simplification. It's a nice way of putting what could very well be a very chaotic state of affairs.
But then we get right back to that, which is the uncertainty. I think collapse, which is an unplanned, unmanageable, cascading downward effect. I also refer to that as a break as opposed to a bend, is possible. Of course, it's possible if you're paying attention. I don't think in the near term that it's the most likely outcome. I think a simplification, given that we're from a starting point, we have massive energy surplus and we have a lot of built infrastructure from past energy surplus. I think a simplification is the more likely outcome. And we might not even have a simplification. We might invent things and, well, we eventually will have a simplification for sure. It might not happen imminently, though I would guess, the middle of my distribution is three years from now or so is when that's going to start. But for Pakistan and Syria and Ukraine and Lytton, British Columbia, that's already happened. Okay, yeah. So the simplification is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about Joven's paradox. I first came across this concept, and just to explain the tendency towards anytime we find more energy, we tend to use more. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. Walter Stanley Jevons was a 19th century economist who had a radical prediction that when they developed the steam engine, which massively was more efficient than what they were using before to pump water out of coal seams, everyone's like, oh, we're going to save so much energy. And he's like, no, we're going to use more energy, because it was so profitable and it was scaled. So the energy efficiency on the individual thing, we used less energy, but we created a lot more things. And so today that's called Jevons paradox. So GDP and energy are 99% correlated. So there's a very tight link between economic growth and energy. For every $100 of GDP, we need like $70 worth of energy input. And it's been very tight for a long time. But humans are clever, and so we get more efficient over time. And in the past 50 years, we've gotten 1% more efficient in how we use energy and resources every single year. And that adds up to quite a bit over 50 years. But during that same time, we've had a massive increase in energy use, because what ends up happening is that productivity results at the margin of people having a little bit savings because their electrical bill went down, or some new product makes more money for people. And so that thing did use less energy to create the electricity at the power plant. But the whole system, people had more money in their pockets to go to Home Depot or Tim Hortons or whatever. So since 1990, as one example, we've increased our energy efficiency 36% globally, but we've increased our energy use by 63%. So Jevons paradox means that energy efficiency at a global level will paradoxically result in more energy use, not less.
And do you think that that's a function of our economy, or is it just human nature to want it more and more and more?
That's two separate questions. I think Jevons paradox is a function of our economy, that we have no caps and taxes to regulate that. Once the economy starts to decline, like say our economy is 100, and then it goes to 98 and 97 and a half and 96 and over years. If that happens, then a 1% efficiency improvement on the way down will be like a Jevons dividend. It's only the fact that it's in a growing, anomalous period of growth that it gets fed back into the energy dissipating structure. Your second question, do humans always want more? Is that human nature? That's an interesting question. I think my answer to that is no. I think that in our ancestral past, prior to 10,000 years ago, we still competed for status, but the status was intelligence or kindness or hunting prowess or storytelling ability. It wasn't how much stuff you had. But then when we found agriculture, we started to store surplus. That created hierarchies. It created power laws where certain people had more. That thing got turbocharged when we found fossil hydrocarbons. It got turbocharged again when we created digital fractional reserve money. And now it's going to get turbocharged again with the advent of artificial intelligence, which is going to be a wealth concentrator like this. So I think in today's society, yes, people want more. And part of it, it's not because they're greedy, it's because they're looking around and seeing other people having more, and they feel like that's our cultural metric. And they're freaked out that if they're going to get sick or something, how the hell are they going to pay the medical bills unless they live in Canada that has a reasonable healthcare system? So I think as long as economic growth is our cultural goal, and as long as we have this massive amount of energy surplus, people the world over are likely to want more.
Yeah, it seems like unless we have some real fundamental ideological cultural shift in the way people think about money, lifestyle, prosperity, perhaps get rid of some of the insecurity that drives and motivates people, we're likely going to see this simplification accompanied by resistance to whatever sort of austere, it will be perceived as austerity, I do believe. And what do you think and this is where we get into the realm of what if, that sort of thing. But what do you think the world is going to look like? How is this going to be received? Because I can see people who are listening to your message, obviously not me, because I understand your perspective, but there's going to be people who are very resistant to any sort of restrictions imposed on them, be it taxation or usage limits or whatever the case might be. There's going to be a lot of pushback. And is this just going to be par for the course? Because if what you're saying is true, there's an inevitable energy decline. And I know you don't say inevitable because you're a scientist, but on the realm of probabilities,
there is an inevitable energy decline. I'll sign up to that statement.
Okay. So if that's the case, then we're going to see some level of materialistic contraction. So how do people, I guess, like, is it going to be like an immediate Mad Max, or is it going to be like, is there going to be a lot of political turmoil? What sort of dystopian film is this going to best look like?
Well, I don't know. And that's why I'm doing this podcast, my podcast. To learn. and to pass the baton to more humans to understand this. And maybe there's some emergent response that I can't quite envision. But let me make one thing clear. I'm not advocating for regulation and restriction of energy use. I don't know what to do. I'm trying to say this is coming. We're going to probably, as a society, have to use less to considerably less to dramatically less energy in the not too distant future. I'm not voting for this. I'm not pushing for it. I see it coming as a biophysical reality. And we need more people preparing as communities, but also a larger pro-social conversation about this. My fear, and you already see this, and I think you're going to see this in spades in 2024 in my country, is that you're going to see more and more people want the freedoms that they had in the past. And this story is going to cause an authoritarian knee-jerk reaction on both sides of the political spectrum, because people are going to want the government, people in charge, to implement the things that their tribe wants and cares about. And I think it's going to be a political cluster. The one thing that unites all the problems that we've mentioned so far is governance. And I don't think our governance system in my country, and I think I can say the same for yours, can even manage the current situation, let alone the whack-a-mole of all this stuff coming down. I don't know what sort of governance system will be capable of handling these things, but it's not the one we currently have. As far as Mad Max, again, I think we could easily get by with 10 or 20% less energy. It's the system and the complexity and all of the intricate social and financial and geopolitical agreements that are in place, that were put in place expecting 2 to 3% economic growth to continue indefinitely. That's what's going to be tripped up. And what I say, the great simplification, and there's a reason and a math behind this, I think when our financial musical chairs game, the music stops, there's kind of a built-in 20 to 30% drop in GDP. And if it's prepared for and it could stabilize there, then we can change the rules and the regulations and have a viable time after that, which is reasonable. The risk is that we blame others and people are freaking out and there isn't a science tethered explanation of what's going on, and that we don't stop at 20 or 30% and cascade down into some of the scenarios that I assume you've talked about on your podcast. I don't think that's the most likely thing, but it's definitely possible. And then the other thing, to answer a question you asked earlier, this sort of conversation you and I are having is actually a little bit socially risky to have, because it's threatening, it's complex, it's abstract, it's in the future. Famous people aren't talking about it. It's threatening to the people who are in charge and have power and in government, because they can't say these things. So if I could press a button and have everyone in the world understand what you and I do about energy and nuclear war and geopolitics and debt and energy depletion and oil and fragility of society, I would not press it. What I'm trying to do is inform that pro-social scout team that can act as metaphorical rocks in the river that don't move much when the water starts rushing. And if there's enough of those rocks, they can act as a foundation that actually shifts the flow of the water. It's horribly complex. And sometimes I just internally, my blood pressure just went up again, because I'm saying things that shouldn't maybe be so glibly said on a public video. And yet here's where we are, Nate. I think what we lack in our society, broader than energy blindness, is a systems awareness and authenticity, the ability to speak uncomfortable truths that are not ideological or based on someone's identity, but are just trying to describe the frickin' game board that we're on, in hopes that other people, other humans that care about their community, the natural world, their country, can become educated and play a role in what's ahead. I mean, that's all we can do, right?
You're trying to present this without an agenda. You're just trying to state the facts. And I could see most people kind of recoiling immediately and saying, well, what do they expect of me? And this is where we lead to, and this is why I think it's so important that we put out at the forefront that, like, we're just stating the facts here. We're not saying what the remedy or the solution necessarily is going to be. We're just telling you what is going to happen if nothing changes, and how we reconcile that, whether it sorts itself out, whether it's Mad Max, is anybody's best guess, whether it's, the whole Klaus Schwab stuff or whatever. I mean, like this is where we see that Don't Look Up. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. Have you seen it?
It was half comedy and half documentary. I thought it was so well done. That is exactly what we're facing, but not only on climate change, but on many of these other issues.
Mm-hmm. So just that acknowledgement and putting that at the forefront, I think, is so important, that otherwise, I don't see, unless we see a shift in that direction towards those more nuanced conversations about this kind of thing, I think inevitably it will result in some sort of crisis. Perhaps it's going to be something that resolves itself and works itself out in terms of the clash of because what you're going to require at some level is a centralization of governance that is going to have more regulation accompanying it. Eventually, you would presume, or do you feel as though this, and I understand you don't have solutions, and I don't expect you to offer any, but is there a way that we can have a simplification without the authoritarianism that might create social chaos?
I don't know. And I think I expect a rightward shift in politics around the world, because people are going to, as soon as events get difficult, they're going to clamor for, I want things to be the way they used to be. And progressive people, where my value systems align, are trying to change things. And I think when these things happen, whatever political party's in charge is going to get blamed. And so we're going to probably still have this whipsaw between political parties after every election. But you can see what's happening in the Netherlands and in Germany and other places. They're voting for more right-wing people because they see some of these things going on. But one of my pet peeves, and I've experienced this in my own podcast, is what you just said, is I have people who are expert on climate change, and they talk for 90 minutes, and I'm trying to get them to talk about the science. Just what is the situation? Let us understand the situation as best as we can. But peppered in there is their solution set and their ideology, and this is what we should do. And it's really two separate conversations. What is our biophysical, our climate, our energy, our financial situation? Let us describe it as best as we can. And then, okay, what would be some of the things to do about it? But what ends up happening, I had this conversation with one of my uncles once, who generally doesn't care about environmental issues. He's like, Nate, explain to me, like I'm sixth grade, what is about climate change? Well, we're emitting carbon this fast. It acts as a thermal blanket, increases the amount of watts per square meter of heat transfer onto the earth. And I unpacked it all for him. He's like, thank you. That really made sense. I understand it. So what are we going to do? And I said, well, we're going to probably have to use less energy. It's going to mean certain freedoms are going to go away. And you could see his mind shifting. And at the end of the conversation, he's like, I don't really believe in all that climate change. So in what are the solutions that will impact people's built identities And if I and you are saying in the future, we're going to probably have to use less energy, not because an authoritarian regime is telling us, it's just there's going to be less energy on the planet. I mean, we've sucked it out with a larger straw. That is going to manifest in people's stories about their own life and the decisions they've made and the house they built and the plans that they had. It's going to tip that apple cart a little bit, and people ain't going to be happy. I'm just observing that. I wish it could be otherwise. I'm not rooting for that scenario, and yet I see it speeding towards us.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that a lot of the leaders and a lot of the even the celebrities who are, trying to provide solutions are the complete opposite of what would be considered an example of somebody who was adapting to this simplification. So they got multiple homes, they're flying in private jets, so until we have somebody to emulate who's actually walking the walk, it's very unlikely that any person is going to take, any average person who's just struggling to get by is going to take these elites seriously unless they themselves, go and live on a yurt and
there's two different embedded questions there. I totally agree with you. Some of these celebrities are hypocrites. Others are just systems blind. They think fossil fuels bad, renewables good, and they're not looking at aggregate consumption as being the real issue. The second issue, though, is one of social status and conformity. We're social primates. We look to others to get signals on what is socially acceptable in our culture. There have been lots of examples in the past of cultures that hoarding wealth and wealth as a conspicuous display of status was actually frowned upon. The Potlatch Indians in Washington State would throw lavish parties and give away resources to other visitors, and that was their show of how magnanimous they were and generous, and that would give them status. So in our culture, there may be some emergent response, and I think it's already happening. I used to teach college with younger humans not caring so much about how big their bank account or how big their car or house is, but they value their success by their experiences and their relationships. And so I think we could change our cultural, what does it mean to be cool and successful metric away from conspicuous consumption towards, other things, kindness or creativity or gardening, who grows the best tomatoes. Hopefully not who has the coolest war wall, but there could be other options.
Well, this is where we might differ, but there are certainly, there's a hard reality to all this, right? Like there's a reason why we need police. There's a reason why we need the military, and accompanying this simplification will be likely a societal degradation in terms of the amount of crime and the sort of dog eat dog, what will we call it, game theory that starts to emerge as a scramble for the remaining low-hanging fruit ensues. So, the war wall, now that you brought it up, is really, it was a clever sort of catchy term to use in a video, but it's primarily, survival in a lot of ways. I guess there's different approaches to this. In Western society, we view survival as a war with nature. So in that respect, yes, it is a battle with the elements. A lot of the things on the war wall are tools that you would utilize in order to acquire energy from the land and that you would use to subsist. But there's definitely, I don't think we can be naive to the obvious risks that come with this simplification. And when I say euphemistically, all I mean is that perhaps it does not communicate all of the negative social consequences that are going to arise, that are going to present some serious challenges. We're seeing it geopolitically. I think, as above, so below, as you have U.S. inner cities declining in terms of just the state of decay in inner cities is noticeable for everybody, whether it's drugs, poverty. You have that happening on a global scale with geopolitics, where we're fighting over stuff now because times aren't as good as they might have been. So I think we have to at the same time acknowledge that this simplification, there's going to be an ugly side to it as well.
I'm teasing you about your war wall. That's actually the only one of your videos I watched, which is why I declined to come on your show when you invited me before. And it's only our one-on-one phone calls that made me realize you're kind of a cool, authentic, pro-social human. I changed my mind because ultimately we're concerned about the same things. Yes, I think there is a possibility of the future that you describe as something that would need such preparation. I'm not preparing for that because I just am kind of hoping and assuming that level of Mad Max doesn't happen. But for your listeners, your podcast is called Canadian Prepper, which the first time I saw it, I thought it was you're preparing for an American invasion once climate change and resources cause Americans to go to Canada. Prepping is like a natural response to uncertainty, and it makes sense. There's something, I used to work on Wall Street. There's something called a Sharpe ratio, which is the risk-adjusted return of a portfolio. And if you just have stocks and you add a lower return thing like commodities or bonds, it actually smooths out the return of the entire portfolio. And so prepping, given everything we're talking about of energy and finance and geopolitics and complexity, is a natural, smart thing for a family and a community to do. But I'm much more interested, and my job is trying to promote this idea of pro-social prepping. Because if we're in a world where everyone's just got a war wall and people are shooting and sorting and lasering and whatever else, first of all, that's not something I want to sign up for. And that means we've already lost. I think we're going to need community, and we're going to need relationships and skills. And what happens if you break your leg? I mean, you're going to need a doctor. So there is a middle ground between having some personal protection and things that you talk about. But I think the real ask is how to start conversations in our communities, start looking at the watershed where we live and realizing this is the thing. Humans are biological organisms that overly care about the present versus the future. And they also don't like uncertainty, and they also follow the consensus trance, which is the herd mentality. If you really just pause and think about the implications of those three things, something interesting comes out the other side, which is we are not going to prepare as a society for what's coming. We are not going to stop using carbon to slow climate change. We're not going to do conservation and taxes and smart strategies. We're going to hit a wall, and then we're going to have to respond. And if you understand that, it actually gives you, for those that follow your podcast and mine, perhaps, a psychological boost of, I can simplify first and beat the rush. My community and my family can do these things ahead of time. We can think in our community of a plan B, or there was a movie Contact with Jodie Foster, and they were building this spaceship to go to outer space. And then some religious wacko blew it up with a terrorist sabotage, and the movie's over. Well, they had a second one in Hokkaido, Japan that no one knew about, which Jodie Foster ended up using and going to outer space. The same sort of thing could be done in communities with the city council is pro-growth and let's build an airport and AI and nuclear fusion to the moon, baby. But there could be a Hokkaido, Japan little city council that's looking at systems ecology and watershed and equipment and resilience and regenerative agriculture and food grown locally and local and regional supply chains from Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Montana, Minnesota, instead of South Korea and South Africa. Those are the sorts of things that we need to accelerate in addition to some of the personal prep that you talk about on your show.
Yeah, there's definitely been an evolution of preparedness, and there are two camps. One camp is, of course, because we live in an individualistic society, a lot of prepping stems from the perspective of protecting myself and my nuclear family. But there is definitely a newfound appreciation for the specialization that comes in groups and the necessity of community as a realistic long term. I think as we see these crises unfold, whether it was the pandemic or the war that's currently raging, we see that these things aren't as abrupt as Hollywood has made out. They tend to be drawn out, and for that you really do require a community more so than just a personal war wall, which is all about you versus the world. So there's definitely a communal component to preparedness. I guess my cynicism of some of these things arises from what I perceive to be like the futility of what you just said, that we're not going to change. So, we need to be prepared for all possibilities. With that comes the component that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And I think it's the thing that makes a lot of people on the left averse to entering this space, but I must say that's changed in the last few years, is the more militaristic component of all this, which unfortunately is an essential component. Like even a community is going to need some level of operational security in order to function, in order to have some level of stability. So yeah, while it's true that we need to look at solutions that are more rooted around like a collectivist mindset, perhaps, we still have to acknowledge that there's going to be crazy stuff that happens. We just got to be prepared to deal with it, right? Because there's not maybe the police response time. It's going to be like a Judge Dredd scenario. I'm not sure if you've seen that one, but a great dystopian film, by the way. You should check it out. Maybe this is a good time to. Do you have anything to add to that?
I don't disagree. It's not my focus. I don't know as much about it as you do. I will say this, though. There's something called the dark triad personality traits. Are you familiar with that?
I think I've heard of it before, yes.
The dark triad is 3 personality traits. One of them is narcissism, one is Machiavellianism, and one is psychopathy. And some people have all 3 of those traits. And it's called the dark triad. And research has shown that 10% of society has those traits, which lead to crime and violence and antisocial behavior. My friends who are experts in this say that when you fill out the survey to see if you are dark triad, if you are a dark triad, you will fill it out in the other direction, so that it's probably closer to 15 or 18% of society has these traits. And as far as corporations and high-level politicians, it's probably 80 or 90%. But as we head forward into the great simplification, this percentage of society in Saskatchewan, in Minnesota, in New York City, in China, around 1 in 10 people have this personality trait, and they will continue to have that in the future. And so we need the community and the pro-social response and maybe protection, as you say, against this demographic of society, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
It's on my mind because I just had a conversation with a psychologist, PhD, about it this morning, and I was like, what? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, just history bears that out, that there's going to be people who do things, like you're saying, that have those 3 traits. And above and beyond that, those people will be likely leading a lot of people who are conformist. I think in your most recent video, you talked about the smoke under the door and the conformity that comes along with just other Confederates being in the same room. And I've being a psychology, having a psychology background, I'm familiar with a lot of the Milgram experience and, experiments and stuff like that. So yeah, there's not only the crazy people, but there's also the people who follow the crazy people, which is problematic. But maybe to take a more, put a positive spin on the end of this, explain how exactly you are going about adapting to the simplification. I know, I'm pretty sure you live in a rural environment, or
Boy, that's another complicated question. Yes, I live on a small farm on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin. I have horses and dogs and chickens and ducks and guinea fowl. I planted 300 hazelnut trees until this year, or until the last few years. We grow 40% of our own food, potatoes, a lot of potatoes. My girlfriend does most of the gardening now. To be totally honest, I've been so busy with this podcast that about a third to a half of my potatoes are still in the ground, and it froze hard last week. I just didn't have time. So I've also recently, I've presented to the city council. I've talked to the sheriff. I've talked to the mayor. I've led a bunch of local meetings trying to get this off the ground on community prep, and I've largely failed because there's so many individual groups and identities. There's the Citizens Climate League, and then there's the farmers, and then there's the constitutionalists, and there's so many different demographics, and to get them in a room, in a town hall, to focus on this when stock markets are near all-time highs and there's 1,000 different Netflix shows to choose from, and we can have pizza delivery and the brown trucks show up at our house with goodies. It's too complex, abstract, and they look at me like I'm a weirdo. So all of my prepping network is online internationally, and friends, like when I go visit them, they're prepping. But in the county where I live, I haven't done much other than generally I consume a lot less than I used to 15 or 20 years ago. I don't need a lot of gadgets and things to make me happy. If I thought about the 10 best experiences of my life, almost all of them had to do with animals or nature or a small group of close friends who were playing cards all night long and having some beers, or a fishing trip with my dad and my brother. All these things didn't require much energy or money. And I think the sooner that we learn that reality, the better that we can shift our outlook of how we want to spend our energy and time in the future. So I don't profess to be sustainable, and I don't think we're headed for a sustainable world. We may be more sustainable than today, but I think after basic needs are met, most of the best things in life are free. And I think the more people that recognize that and start to live it a little bit ahead of the time when they're going to be forced to live it, and not necessarily forced by governments, but just forced by our reality of the stuff that we're pulling out of the ground, expecting it to last forever.
yeah, and I don't think anybody can really disagree with that, because nobody's going to remember the 10th pair of shoes they bought, or the TV that, back in 97 or whatever, that was brand new. But we will remember, if we go back through our catalog of memories, like you just said, a lot of these events that we remember, and these things, it didn't require us to have to go above and beyond in terms of our consumption of material items. So you talk about sustainability, and I guess there's a component of this. Like, do you have solar panels? Do you have anything like that?
We have solar hot water on the roof, so the sun heats the tubes, and so we don't have to use natural gas for hot water. But the rest of the house is I heat with wood, and then the electricity is natural gas, basically from the local utility. I'm thinking about solar panels, but that would be not a sustainability choice. It would be a resilience choice, that in case there's blackouts or something in the future, that I would have solar and batteries. And they've gotten quite inexpensive relative to where they were, but they're still pretty damn expensive. Like $16,000 or something would be for my size house. The short answer is no. I don't have much of that.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of your other bases covered, though.
The most important thing that I've done is I bike a lot, Nate. And when I bike, I live in the country. And the last 3 years, I've made it a point that when anyone, of course, in the country, there's not a house every 50 yards. It's every few hundred yards, there's a house. Anytime anyone is outside working in their yard or playing with their dog or just getting to their car, I'll quick bike up their little driveway and say hello to them. I don't tell them what I do, of course, but I'm trying to meet more people where I live.
That's great advice. I know it's not advice, but I think it's a great approach to getting to know your community. Hopefully, we can have some measure of not necessarily growth, but perhaps there's a happy medium between maybe not spending exorbitant amounts of energy, but not necessarily just being in a stasis level of sustainability where we're, like you're saying, you can go out, you can get solar panels, you can get some of these amenities that might create a excess use of what's necessarily required in order to survive, but still maintain a balance and equilibrium with the what can be taken from the environment without having a detrimental long-term effect on our own ability to survive. Because that's what this is all about. Because you're going to get a lot of people, in the comment section say things like, well, the earth has been here for such and such, and, it's going to continue to be here. And I'll say, sure, it will, but we might not be, because our habitat is going to be
Do you read
destroyed.
the comments? I have to stop reading the comments. It's really aggravating, and it doesn't help me so much, even though a lot of them are really thoughtful and nice. Two thoughts to what you just said. First of all, it depends what we grow. So our entire economy is implicitly built on maximizing profits. Profits are tethered to energy. Energy is tethered to fossil energy, and the whole thing we call GDP. And if GDP goes up, we call that a success. We could grow things like intelligence or community or soil or other things that are meaningful over time, rather than just turning billions of barrels of ancient sunlight into microliters of dopamine. But the other thing is solar and wind, especially solar, it's pretty cool stuff. But we're not going to live in a 19 terawatt global society. 19 terawatts is the amount of continuous energy 24/7 that humans are accessing, which is the same amount as 190 billion 100-watt light bulbs turned on 24/7. We're not going to do that with solar panels. But if you had nothing and you had solar panels and maybe a battery, boy, you could do a lot. You could charge a laptop or a cell phone. So the question isn't one of technology solving our problems. It's having a different recognition, first of all, as individuals and maybe as a society, that we don't need all this energy and stuff to be happy. So again, this is not, I don't know how that's going to all shake out, but we don't need all this energy and stuff to be happy. I'm pretty sure of that, because I use a fraction of the energy and money that I used to.
So what does this mean for the advancement of technology? If what you're saying requires or might require some level of technological regression, it would seem, unless, the wild card, AI, nuclear fusion, which of course there'd still be Jevons paradox to contend with. Or will it just be technological progress for a select few who are going to leverage robotics and automation to maintain their standard of living while the rest of us just kind of wither on the vine type thing?
It's a huge question. I think we will always be inventors and have technology. We invented stone tools back in the day. I think we've reached a point where technology is not the answer to what we face. We're going to have a deeper, broader response than just tech. I think for a while, tech might offset the decline of energy and material quality and quantity, but not for too long. And you're absolutely right. If we develop nuclear fusion, and by the way, if that happened today, we would need 20 years to have safety and to roll it out and everything. But you're absolutely right. If humans today had too cheap to meter, unlimited, cheap, free energy, we would destroy the planet because we would draw in all sorts of non-carbon limiters like soil and ecosystem health and copper, and it wouldn't be good. I think you're absolutely right. And my fear is that AI is there's probably going to be a couple hundred or even 100 AIs. And I don't even like the word AI because it's really not artificial intelligence. It's more SI, or simulated intelligence. But I think the AI won the PR game when those two terms were used in the past. I do think that is going to, and I did a Frankly podcast on this a couple of weeks ago about the one ring of power. And I think AI is going to accelerate the power dynamic that we've had and will result in the first trillionaire, maybe Elon Musk. I think people get confused and they think that's the AI that's going to change the world. No, that's the public interface of one type of AI. A lot of AIs are privately owned or owned by militaries and governments that are doing autonomous drones in Ukraine and Russia, or figure out how to make $1 million really quickly using whatever. And I fear that it will not only be an end to people's belief in information, and it will drastically impact your podcast and mine unless we adapt. I think beyond that, it will serve as a wealth concentrator, and it's possible that a lot of people will be left behind, not only the painters and the video editors and things that the tasks can be replaced, but that a big swooshing sound will go to the owners of the AI and where the power goes. And I'm quite worried about it, to be honest. And it's not something that I understood before because I thought oil depletion would be the central story. And I'm now seeing like how potent AI really could be in changing the way the world works. But I think you could pull the plug too. And if there's a risk and people are really, AI requires a lot of energy too. So I'm not an expert on it, but I know people that are really, really worried about AI.
And maybe just one final question for you, because you said you had a background in Wall Street and the markets, and what triggered the shift in your thinking towards your PhD, which is in a different area of study, I guess? Like, were you the typical Wall Street guy, or were you just interested in economics?
I hated economics in business school. I liked finance because it was currencies and interest rates. And I used to manage money for billionaires. That was my job on Wall Street. And one of my clients started trading oil futures. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And I started to read about oil. And I became so obsessed with it. First of all, I learned, oh my God, this stuff is incredibly powerful. How come I never knew that what it contributes to our economy is 1,000 times what it's cost to extract? So that was a big moment. Then I learned, oh my God, it's going to peak and decline in my lifetime. And then I learned that the pollution, that when we burn it, it has emissions that act as a thermal blanket enveloping the earth that raises the temperature, and that in the past, volcanoes that did this ended in mass extinctions. And that's price is not included in the price of things that we buy. It's an externality. I became so obsessed with that I eventually gave my clients their money back. I quit. I hiked in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba for 6 months with my dog and a backpack full of books. And I went and got my PhD and studied on this. And to answer your question, only moderately long instead of super long, looking at the world with a monetary lens is looking one step ahead. Looking at the world with an energy lens and measuring the cost and benefits in terms of energy and resources and ecology is looking 2 or 3 steps ahead. So that's why I did my PhD on net energy, which is how much energy we have left after the biophysical costs are accounted for. I thought made sense.
So really, you're in a good position to give people long-term financial advice then now. Just kidding.
Well, yeah, actually I am, because our entire financial model is about to be upended. The last 60 years, kind of the standard Wall Street stockbroker recommendation is the 60-40 model, where you put 60% of your portfolio in stocks and 40% in bonds. But now we're kind of at the peak of the carbon pulse, probably. And I think 25% stocks, 25% bonds, 25% cash in case things go crazy, and 25% at least in commodities, because we're going to have inflation. But that's now. I think in the future, what people are really going to have to intuit is all of these financial investments. Financial capital is a marker only for real capital. And real capital is our human capital, which is our health and our knowledge, and in your case, your biceps and your physical fitness, your social capital, which is our friends, our networks, built capital, which is our chainsaws and our house and our solar panels and such, and natural capital, which is the ecosystems and the natural world and the communities and the rivers and the clean air where we live. And so finance is just a marker for that stuff. So I do actually think that the entire financial edifice is supported on an energy plume that is about to start to dissipate. And people are not prepared for that because they think that it's a natural law that stocks go up 10% a year. And the reason they've been going up is because the world central banks have been responding to the great financial crisis and the COVID crisis, and these temporary measures have been going on for 13 years with these central banks growing their balance sheets, too big to fail guarantees, artificially low interest rates, and all this stuff. And it's been great if you're an owner of financial capital, but I think these are not long-term responses. The only long-term response is more energy, more innovation, and technology. And if we have less energy, innovation and technology are going to have to do a lot more than they have.
Wow. Nate Hagens, everyone. It's been great having you out here today. And I just got to say, where can people best get informed about what you do? Would you recommend just your podcast on YouTube, or is there another place that we can refer people to learn more about your work?
Yeah, I think go to the YouTube channel, Nate Hagens on YouTube. And when you get there, the very first thing that will pop up is a 30-minute animated movie called The Great Simplification, which you referenced earlier. I have podcasts every Wednesday with people in energy, finance, neuroscience, climate. And then on Fridays, I have something called a Frankly, which is my take on something going on in the world. And within the website or the Substack or the Twitter, you can find everything, but probably the YouTube channel is the easiest place to go. I will say this, though, on our podcast site, which is thegreatsimplification.com, every episode is there, and every episode has dozens to, in some cases, hundreds of footnotes and references. I have a staff, my former college student, creates references for every fact that we say in our podcast, and that itself has quite a lot of reference material for people to look at.
I got to say, the guests that you have on are just first-rate people. Like, every guest you've had on has captured my attention in some way, shape, or form. So I would strongly encourage people to go and check out your YouTube channel. You won't be disappointed. And I look forward to seeing you on more prominent podcasts. Like I have a feeling you'll have a great conversation with Lex Friedman, maybe even Joe Rogan. You guys can talk about psychedelics or something like that. That'd be a cool conversation to see.
Thank you. I mean, this is where we're at. We have to broaden the conversation about our reality and get more people involved. And there are plenty of conversations out there that are disconnected from reality. So thanks for being curious and being a good dude. And thanks for having me on your show.
No problem. Thanks for coming out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.